Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History in Games. Today I'm interviewing Adrienne Mayer, who's a research scholar, a folklorist, and historian of ancient science. She's the author of many fantastic books on robots, Amazons, and dinosaurs, and their connection to real scientific observations made by people in antiquity like the ancient Greeks and Romans. This was such a fun interview. We talked quite a bit about video games like Horizon Zero Dawn and Horizon Forbidden West. We touched on games like God of War, Nier, Far Cry, Blood Dragon, and we talked about Wonder Woman and just how all of these subjects are not only popular with people, but the stories about these monsters and heroes and advanced robots were based on reality, real ideas and observations people had made in the past, and how these observations are being validated by modern archaeologists, paleontologists, and historians today. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you do, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/MEGHANR Sullivan so I can make History in Games a full-time gig. I believe in the power of history and the power of video games as a vehicle to educate people, whether it's about history or science or art or any number of scholastic disciplines. So again, thank you so much for being here and please enjoy. So I guess the way we can begin this interview is I'll have you sort of introduce yourself and who you are and what your work is. And I know that I'm curious about this, like how you sort of got into the field of research that you did, because it sounds like an interesting story.
It seems kind of random. I don't have much of a trajectory, but in my own mind, all my books are actually connected in some way, but they seem very separate to outside observers, I think.
Well, I mean, you can see that there is a through line, that there is I think I was, when I was researching your work, someone used the term geomythology to sort of explain that a lot of these things that seem fantastic, Amazons and dinosaurs and ancient robots and futuristic robots. I mean, these are based on real things. So how did you stumble into, I guess, have you always been interested in history and dinosaurs and Amazons, or how did that come about?
Well, I've always been interested in the sort of like the things that should be outtakes or curious oddities and peculiarities about ancient history, and I was always thinking that especially in mythology and legends about nature or animals, things like that, things in the natural world, that there must have been some sort of core of truth or nugget of scientific and historical reality, that somehow these myths have embedded in them real observations and attempts to interpret very puzzling things that people saw in nature before the invention of science. So what I'm really interested in are the first inklings of science, or the inklings of scientific impulse, I guess you might say. So all of my books do have that thread, I think, of trying to find out if there are any real germs of truth or insights and perspectives from antiquity that show that people were really paying attention and trying to explain weird things in their culture or in their landscape.
Yeah.
So my first book was about you just held it up as the first fossil hunters.
Yes.
My husband suggested that I call it the fossil hunters in togas. The first fossil hunters. Because actually, pre-scientific people from all cultures who live in fossiliferous lands, of course, would come across gigantic or remarkable bones that were larger than any animal they knew in real life. And you don't just, you plow up a thigh bone that's as tall as you are, you don't just toss it aside, you try to explain it. So I was really interested in that. I couldn't believe that no one else tried to ferret out that information. So I worked on that, and I looked at about 25 or 30 ancient Greek and Latin authors, and I found at least 100 instances where they describe finding large bones that belong to creatures they couldn't identify. And of course, they attempt to identify them. So they relate them to the mythology they had about giants and dragons and monsters and sea serpents and things like that. So I think this really ties into all the gamers' imaginations, because we love recreating creatures that we've never seen, but we've got evidence, we've got traces of them. So I
I
think there's a continuity there.
Gosh, you really put your finger on the pulse of things, which is in pop culture. Amazons, robots, dinosaurs, they're everywhere, particularly in video games, whether it's, and they love to combine these things too. So
Yeah.
before the interview started, I was showing you pictures of a character named Aloy from a
Yes.
series called Horizon, and she's a strong Amazonian woman who fights robot dinosaurs in a post-apocalyptic world. And then you've got other games like Far Cry Blood Dragon, where you're fighting dinosaurs with lasers, and games like Near Automata about, these androids who have basically, they're all that's left in a post-apocalyptic world. So the humans are, no one knows where they went. And we are just fascinated by Amazons and dinosaurs and robots, and it keeps coming up again and again. I mean, I'm wearing a Wonder Woman t-shirt, right? Like Amazons are part of pop culture. And I guess this is kind of a profound question to start off with, but what is it about dinosaurs, robots, Amazons? What is it about these subjects that is just so fascinating to people? Why are we so obsessed?
Well, it's of course it's overdetermined. There are many reasons. It's all very layered. But I've noticed that very young children are fascinated with dinosaurs.
Yes.
And they love dinosaurs. And if they never get over it, they either become fantasy artists or gamers or paleontologists, right? or they continue to love dinosaurs. And there have been many explanations for why do young children love these huge creatures that are so scary. They love them because they're really powerful, and they already are under the thumb of their parents, and so they sort of like want to become the allies of these other powerful creatures. That's one pediatrician, child psychologist view of why children love dinosaurs. But I think we all love to be in awe and actually afraid of things that are really powerful and strong, that are just they seem to overwhelm us puny humans. And yet somehow, if we can face them and sort of either interact with them to become allies with them, or maybe even more common, destroy them, then we feel braver and stronger ourselves somehow. So there's just this fascination with things that are awesome and more powerful than we are. And dinosaurs fit that bill. And then you can also let your imagination roam and just send it out there, because we don't really know what dinosaurs were really like. We have to use our imagination. So we actually have to tap into that fantasy side of ourselves to bring them to life. And then robots are very similar in that way, that they're very powerful. They seem something like us, but not quite. And so they're machines, and kids are also fascinated with robots and machines, I know. So it's a really strong impulse for us to be fascinated with machines, and a combination of dinosaurs with machines. How can you resist? It's almost perfect. And I love all this art. I guess it's called retrofuturism, or future past, sort of imagining abandoned abandoned robots from somehow a lost advanced civilization that once had these advanced machines, and that you would then find them, or that they would come to life again, or something like that. I think Laputo was one of the first kids' stories about an island with abandoned robots. And now there are just so many artworks and then video games about robots from some advanced civilization that are coming to life again. And like you say in Horizon, I watched a 25-minute clip of Horizon, and I just loved it. It was really cool. And I love her name, Alloy. It means combining metals to make a machine resistant to corrosion and stronger than it would be otherwise. So her name is really cool too. And
I just
like
learned
that.
something new.
Amazons always have these really cool names. So she's a perfect Amazon. I love it. It's
Oh my gosh.
yeah.
I love that you love it. I did not know that about her name. I never gave much thought to her name. I just learned, I was today years old when I learned that. So
Yeah.
I'm very excited. But what's even more exciting, which sort of ties into the history part of it, is that your work makes it clear that, when we talk about these fantastic monsters and beings, these over the top things. So we'll start with the first fossil hunters, because I love this book and I can't get enough of it, which is all about paleontology in Greek and Roman times and how the Greeks and Romans interpreted prehistoric bones. And you make a fantastic argument that these creatures like Cyclops and Griffins, they're not fictional. They were based on actual prehistoric bones. And so I guess what I want to ask is, first, what inspired you to make that connection? And then can you tell the audience what these Cyclops and these Griffins possibly really were? Because it's really a fascinating story.
Well, I got interested in what pre-scientific people might have thought about finding fossils. I grew up in South Dakota where there were lots of dinosaur fossils. So I was very aware of fossils that would be found in the ground along with rocks. And I always wondered what Native Americans thought about them as well. So when I went to Greece for the first time, I went to an island called Samos, and I heard that there was a fossil museum above the post office, and I really wanted to see this. So we went to the center of the island on motorbikes, and I got to see this room above the post office in this tiny Greek village that had these gigantic bones. They had thigh bones 6 feet long and huge skulls, and they had all been found on that island. And I learned that these kind of fossils were found throughout mainland Greece and all the islands and on the western part of what is now Turkey. And over in the stairwell, I saw another thigh bone that was covered with red dirt. And I said, well, what's that? Oh, a farmer just plowed that up on the island, and he just brought it to the museum. And that's when it hit me. Well, if farmers today are plowing these up, people in antiquity did too. And why hasn't anyone ever studied that? So I made it my mission to try to find out whether the ancient Greeks and Romans talked about finding giant bones, and they did. It turns out that they did. As I said, I found about 100 different instances in which they describe finding remarkable bones or teeth or claws, and they measured them. They even measured the skull capacity with amphoras of water to see how much water they would hold. And they tried to interpret these, and they displayed them in temples as the remains of giants. They believed that giants once lived in Greece before puny present-day human beings appeared there. They also believed that all the ancient heroes, like Heracles, Achilles, Odysseus, they thought that all of those great heroes from the golden age of myth were about 3 times the size of human beings. Everything was bigger and better in the right? And so they would display these bones either as relics of giant heroes or monsters from mythology. And it was really interesting to me that no one had bothered to gather all that information to show that people really did pay attention to these things and use their best rational brains to try and account for them. And of course, they weren't wrong. Giant creatures did live in Greece before puny present-day humans appeared there.
Right. And you talk about in your book, I love what you talk the search for the griffin, which isn't even technically Greek, but the Greeks and Romans had contacts as far as parts of Central Asia, and that you found out that the griffin may actually be a specific dinosaur, which I thought was
Yes, and
really
like all
cool.
good monsters, though, it comes through many translations. So often gets that kind of information passed along like that gets garbled. But we know that the Greeks found out about the creature they called the griffin, which had 4 legs, about the size of a wolf, and strangest of all, it had 4 legs, but it had a head like a raptor with a beak. And the Greeks first found out about this creature from early travelers that went out on the Silk Route toward Asia and toward Mongolia. And they brought back stories of these fierce creatures with 4 legs and a beak that guarded the deposits of gold that the Scythian nomads, that the nomadic people of Central Asia and the steppes had lots of gold. They were known for their just fabulous treasures of gold. And the Greeks had no idea where they got this. So you can imagine that the nomads might have made up this story to keep people away from their deposits of gold, because as you go to the foothills of the mountains to get the gold, you would have to pass through desert areas where there are very plentiful fossil remains of dinosaurs, various dinosaurs. Some of them the Protoceratops, and others called the Psittacosaurs have 4 legs and beaks, and they made their nests on the ground and laid their eggs on the ground. And some of these areas are vast nesting grounds. And I've talked to paleontologists who say you cannot walk through this area without coming across beautifully articulated dinosaur skeletons, some of the most exquisitely preserved dinosaurs fossils in the world. There's some in a standing position, and they erode out, the beak comes out first, and then the rest of the body. So you can imagine that people made stories about these fantastic creatures that they saw that seemed to be a combination of mammals and birds, which is how we think of dinosaurs today too. So the insights are early insights and first inklings are right there.
Yeah, it sort of came full circle, didn't it? That,
Yeah.
we're kind of rediscovering now that some dinosaurs had feathers, and
That's
they did
right. And
have.
in fact, the ancient Greeks and Romans tried to imagine what these creatures must have looked like and how they behaved. And they did know that they said they made nests on the ground. In fact, the dinosaurs made their nests on the ground, and that they laid their eggs. And sometimes the eggs were stone eggs. You could find stone eggs. And of course, they're petrified, so they are stony. And they also, some artists and writers imagined that griffins had feathers, others thought they had scales, others thought they had fur. So they also tried to speculate on what they looked like. And now we know that they did have scales and feathers.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So they were right. The ancients were way ahead of us. And I like that you include pictures of so for the idea of a cyclops, I'll put in some B-roll so people can see this a little more clearly. But you said that, cyclops may have been inspired by mammoth bones, and that if you stand a mammoth, on its hind legs, I mean, this is the stuff of nightmares. I mean, no wonder they thought that cyclops may have been a real thing. If you're coming across these scary bones in Italy and Sicily, and you're like, what was this thing? And you've never
Yes.
seen an elephant until Alexander the Great, you don't know.
Yes, that's right. And so if you go to a museum of natural history and stand in front of a mammoth or mastodon skeleton, or even a modern elephant skeleton, there's a large hole in the center of the forehead. The eye sockets are very small on the side. You wouldn't even notice that. What you'd notice is that big hole in the front. And you might naturally imagine that that's the eye socket, a single eye socket. So that idea was first put forth by an Austrian paleontologist in about 1914. It wasn't really taken up, but I delving into the history of early paleontology, I discovered that he speculated that ancient sailors found prehistoric fossil elephant skulls in caves. They're very common in the Greek islands, Aegean and the Mediterranean. And sailors would find these caves with this gigantic skull with a single eye socket, and then scattered bones all around. And they would imagine a large one-eyed ogre with cannibalistic tendencies.
Yeah. And I can see why, and I can also see why if you come across these giant bones that look human, you might think that these are the heroes of old, because one thing that I love about the first fossil hunters, that you answer a question I've had forever reading ancient authors like Herodotus, is you have, all these ancient Greeks looking for the heroes' bones, their favorite heroes and their bones.
Yeah.
And they would go to very specific places and get very specific bones, and they would have pomp and circumstance bringing these bones back. And if you don't know any better, you think, what about you gullible Greeks? Like, who would actually believe this? But these were probably giant mammoth bones, or giant prehistoric mammals or dinosaurs that they were
Yes.
that they were dealing with. So to them, it was very real.
Yes, and of course, Greece and the whole Aegean area is subject to earthquakes. So the bones are not articulated like the ones in Central Asia. And there are no dinosaurs in that area. They're all prehistoric mammals, so very large early mammals like mastodons and mammoths and giant rhinoceroses and things like that they were finding the bones of, but they're jumbled and scattered. So, and some of them are crumbled. So what you usually find are the most durable and largest bones, like a shoulder blade or a thigh bone. And a thigh bone of a mammoth is about 3 times the size of a human thigh bone.
Oh,
And they
geez.
knew human anatomy very well. And I find it interesting that they thought that their ancient heroes were 3 times the size of puny humans of today. And of course, mammal bones all have the same morphology. They look the same. A mammoth thigh bone looks exactly like a human thigh bone, but 3 times as big.
Yeah, what's interesting though about hero worship in ancient Greece is, even today we still think of our superheroes as super powered. They're bigger, they're stronger, they're faster. But in modern times, they tend to be on the side of moral righteousness and defending the good and the weak, and they stand for justice. And I can't help but notice that in ancient Greece, that was not the case. That a lot of these heroes would, they're pouty and sulky and indiscriminately killed, cough, Achilles, cough, and you've got wily Odysseus and all of these heroes they really weren't so nice, and they would use, and just to bring up another book that you wrote about Greek fire, poison arrows, and scorpion bombs, which is all about just ancient biological warfare and tactics. And you have a whole chapter dedicated to how, like, heroes like, you know, Heracles and, yeah, Achilles and Odysseus, I mean, they were not ashamed to use underhanded tactics and unconventional warfare. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about their methods, and how is it that, like, what defined an ancient Greek hero, because they weren't morally that great. I
No,
don't
that's
know.
very interesting. They're flawed. They're very. You could say that they're superhuman, and their flaws are super too. I mean, they cause a lot of death and mayhem and destruction. All of these heroes. So the Greeks, of course, saw them as well-rounded human beings with tragic flaws, and of course the goal of any ancient Greek hero, whether living or mythological, is to die honorably in face-to-face combat. And if you go to the myths, not one of the ancient heroes dies in that heroic manner. They all have ignominious deaths.
They really do.
Odysseus was stabbed by a son that he was estranged from, stabbed accidentally with a spear made with the ray from a stingray, with the point from a stingray. And Achilles was killed by an arrow that hit him in the back of the heel, a poisoned arrow. And we know that Achilles poisoned his own arrows and spears because Odysseus's son tripped against Achilles' spear on the way to the Trojan War and received a suppurating, unhealing wound because it was poisoned. And Homer tells us that Odysseus goes to a special place in Greece to find poison plants to put on his arrows. So we have all these unconventional biological weapons used by ancient heroes, and this is, these stories were written almost 3,000 years ago. people thought that biological and chemical weapons were modern inventions because they believed that you had to have a scientific understanding of toxicology and pathological plants and how the toxins worked. But you don't. All you have to do is experiment and then be underhanded enough to resort to those weapons. Even biological and chemical weapons go all the way back to Greek mythology.
What do you think was the most insidious weapon that the ancient Greeks and Romans and ancient people came up with? Because they had some nasty things.
My favorite has got to be the grenades filled with live scorpions.
Oh yes, the scorpion bombs. Yes, I was rereading a bit that passage over the weekend, and I was just like, oh, that just sounds like a nightmare.
It would be a nightmare, but it's a really interesting point. These were used against the Romans at the fortress of Hatra, which was on the spice route. It's that you can go and see the ruins today if you dare to go to Iraq. They're near Mosul, where Bush's troops were looking for weapons of mass destruction.
That's
Back
ironic.
in the 2nd century AD, the people of that fortress went out into the desert and packed terracotta pots filled with death stalker scorpions alive, and then sealed the pots and waited till the Romans put their ladders up and began climbing the walls and just throw the pots down on them, and they smash against the Roman armor. And the point, as you bring up, is really insidious, nefarious, horrible idea, nightmarish idea. That's one of the points of biological and chemical weapons, is that is the psychological effect. It doesn't even matter if the scorpion stung anyone, just the idea that these pots are breaking on you and the scorpions are crawling out.
Yeah, that's just terrifying to even think about. You're right. If they were lucky enough not to get stung, they probably panicked. I know I would.
They did. They withdrew their siege, and Romans don't usually do that. They usually stick around, but
yep. But even they had their threshold, and they're like, nope,
yes.
nope. That is kind of amazing. And what's also amazing is, we sort of sanitize these Greek heroes today. I think the only piece of media that doesn't sanitize these Greek heroes and make them heroic is a series called God of War, where you have this very angry Spartan named Kratos who uses unconventional weapons and warfare to try to bring down the Greek pantheon, which he blames for the murder of his family. And he's not meant to be likable. And I think sometimes we forget that a lot of these Greek heroes, it wasn't about, what made them heroic wasn't that they were necessarily nice. I feel like that didn't really that self-sacrificing element didn't come in till, I don't know if it's Leonidas and his 300 and their self-sacrifice is what sort of turned the tide. But these heroes had a different definition of what made them heroic. So I think
that's right. What made them heroic is that they were brave and courageous, and their goal was to die honorably in battle. They're not necessarily good human beings. I mean, even Heracles, he killed members of his family. He did all sorts of what we would call unheroic acts. And Achilles, of course, he won't give up his slave woman captive of war. And Odysseus is the one who's poisoning his arrows, and even the king of the land where he goes to get the poison plants says, well, this is really underhanded. This isn't a very noble weapon. And yet he's one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology. But the Greeks knew this, and these heroes also had tragedies written about them because they're flawed and they have all these characterological problems. I don't think the idea of the self-sacrificing hero came into most people's minds in Europe until after the Middle Ages and Christianity. I think that's when we get these knights who are fighting dragons and die heroically.
That's really interesting. But what's even more interesting is that you have all these heroes, and yet almost none of them are women, that women in ancient Greece were always kind of they either needed rescuing or they were kind of the bad guys. If you look at Clytemnestra and you look at Helen
Yeah,
of her sister Helen of Sparta, Helen of Troy, and you look at Medea, even in real life, there were not many women warriors, but there was one woman, Queen of Halicarnassus, Artemisia, who was the first naval commander in history. And the Greeks put a
yeah,
bounty on her head because they're like, nah, I can't, no, the
yeah.
women can't fight. And they were,
No, Greek men had a problem with strong, independent women. They
they,
kept their own women pretty restricted.
yeah,
A proper Greek wife and daughter and sisters and mothers all were expected to stay at home and mind children and weave. And I think all these myths that you just mentioned about the strong, independent women, they're very frightening. And you can talk about Medusa in that way too, but so they had a problem with that, but they're also fascinated with the idea of strong, independent women, as long as they're not Greek. So all these
yes.
myths about Amazons, they're fierce female warriors from foreign lands. And so they love those stories. I mean, the fact that we have over 200 names that have survived from antiquity of Amazon warriors shows how wildly popular these stories were. Everyone must have known hundreds of these stories by heart, or they were familiar with them. So they had this sort of ambivalent push-pull, fear, awe, respect, and desire for those strong warrior women. And we were just talking about how the Greek heroes, none of them die heroically in face-to-face battle. Every single Amazon that we hear about achieves that heroic goal. No Amazon ever died of old age. Some Greek heroes did. I mean, Jason of Jason the Argonauts, he died an old man. He was taking a nap next to his rotting ship, the Argo, and a timber fell from the ship and killed him. So Theseus, the founder of Athens, he died an old man. So no Amazon ever died of old age. They always died in battle.
That's so ironic that men
Yeah.
project this fantasy on these women. They're terrified, but they're fascinated. And you wrote a book that explains that the Amazons were not fictional; that they were in fact based on real women warriors from Central Asia and the nomad steppes.
Yes, we have all these myths, but thanks now to archaeology, I would say fairly recent and spectacular archaeological finds in the area around the Black Sea and then extending all the way to Mongolia and even China. There really were warrior women in that in the nomadic culture that stretched from the Black Sea all the way to the Great Wall of China. In fact, the Great Wall of China was built to keep these people out, to protect China from these fierce warlike people, where the women and the men actually went to battle together. And we now know that the Greeks would have met some of these Scythians as they began exploring around the Black Sea area. And thanks to the archaeology, we now know that the myths, once thought to be pure fantasy or even propaganda to try and control Greek women, actually contains accurate details about the steppe nomads' lifestyle, what their clothing, what kind of clothing they wore, what kind of equipment, and the weapons that they used. In Greek face paintings, we can see that the Greek artists began to make them more and more historically and culturally accurate in their weapons and show them on horseback using bows and arrows and spears and battle axes. And it just becomes more and more accurate the more they know about these women.
Yeah, it's really interesting that dichotomy of strong, independent women, but also they're to be feared, and you send heroes after them, and yet it's the women who have to take care of so many things for men, and they don't get credit. So we were just talking about Jason, who he dies a lonely old man, and he gets in real trouble because he abandons his wife Medea, which may not have been the smartest thing. He already knew that she was capable of some pretty nefarious things herself, and it's Medea who helps the Argonauts in a lot of their adventures, and she's the one who sort of brings down kind of sliding to our next subject about robots and AI, which is so fascinating. And she's the one who figures out how to bring down the great robot of Crete, Talos. And she's the one who figures it out. And she's sort of, shunned by the ancient Greeks. But if it weren't for her, I mean, the Argonauts would have been in real trouble against this automaton. It's crazy.
It's interesting. Medea, of course, is not Greek. She's from the exotic lands of the East. She's from that area that would now be the Republic of Georgia. So across the Black Sea. And you're right, Jason and the Argonauts are just they just sort of passive and clueless throughout that epic, and she's the one who figures everything out and saves their lives many times over. I think of her as sort of a techno wizard. I mean, she figures out how to destroy this giant robot called Talos, a bronze man who is half machine, half human, mostly machine. He's made of bronze, but he does fit our modern definition of robot because he's self-moving, he has internal workings, and he has a power source. And that's the definition of a robot today. He has inner workings are described as a single artery or vein or conduit that goes from his head down to his toes. And the power source pulsates in that tube, which is described. The word they use for it in antiquity is vein. So they use a biological word for it, but he is a machine. And what is the power source? It's ichor. And ichor is the life source of the gods. It's what makes them immortal. It's this mysterious life fluid of the gods. So that's his power source. And his whole vivisystem, if you want to call it that, is sealed with a bronze bolt on his ankle. Well, Medea knows this, so she says, well, they say, he might be immortal. He's got ichor, but if we remove the bolt, it'll all bleed out and we can destroy him. So she somehow convinces Talos that she can make him immortal. He doesn't realize his own nature. He doesn't know that he's immortal. So he agrees to this. And that's kind of a human aspect of Talos, that this sort of AI robot would make a decision on his own that is not expected by the person who made him or the person who is deploying him.
Do you say I kind of see him as a sympathetic character? Do you agree that
Yes,
Talos is a sympathetic character because of those
absolutely.
human attributes that he has?
Yes, and he wants to be immortal, invulnerable, and the vase paintings that show Jason and Medea using a tool to remove the bolt on his ankle. In those vase paintings, Talos is very humanized, and there's one vase painting that shows him falling backwards, and his eyes are rolling back, and there is actually a tear that is dripping from his eye. So we know that, like as you say, the Greeks felt sympathy for him. After all, he's just killed for doing his job, right? He's supposed to protect the island of Crete from invaders, and Jason and the Argonauts are the invaders. So it's a complex story.
It is a complex story, and it sort of combines, this strong woman with robots and heroes who are a little bit complex themselves. Their pasts
Absolutely.
and their futures are kind of messy.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And I think that's why they have an enduring appeal today, and that's why I think the best games are probably the most complex, so that you have layers of emotions and reactions to what's happening in the characters.
Yeah, there's a series called Near that is very much about the future of androids and robots and a post-apocalyptic world, and your characters, your heroes do some kind of unsavory things. You begin to wonder, am I really the hero here? Am I the bad guy? You start having more sympathy for the robots and shades and everything that is supposed to be the villains. And somewhere along the way, it's in the back of your mind of like, am I on the right side of history?
Yeah.
And you're not so sure with a lot of these games. It's like Kratos and God of War. Am I the baddie? I think I'm the baddie. You're not entirely sure. There's not a whole lot of sympathetic characters, but I like that Greek mythology and Greek history sort of explores the complexity of human nature, whether it's,
That's right.
robots or humans.
That's right. Yes. Yes, I approve. I think that's great. Yeah.
So I guess to wrap up, we do have this obsession with robots and Amazons and dinosaurs, but a lot of our stories feel like cautionary tales, where there's that line in Jurassic Park where your scientists are so busy trying to figure out if they didn't stop to think if they should. Are we going in the right direction, you think, when it comes to technology in terms of smart AI and cloning and biology? Is there any upside of that, or are we going down a dangerous path, do you think? It's kind of a profound question, but I'm curious to
It's
know your
a,
thoughts about where
it's a
we're heading.
profound, it's a really profound question you'd have to ask some philosophers, and especially philosophers of AI ethics. Uh, but I do notice that in the mythology, the Greek mythology about automatons and artificial life, uh, a lot of those doubts and qualms are embedded in the early mythology. Um, and even Sophocles, the great playwright, in one of his tragedies, talks about how human beings just have this magnificent creativity and ingenuity and inventiveness and innovation. And he warns that it can be used for wonderful things, but it also can be used for evil. So this idea of advanced technology being only good is, of course, not true. We can all think of all the bad things that can be done with AI and surveillance, things like this. I mean, they're always presented to us. All these new technologies are presented as beneficial, but we can, even we, non-technological people, can figure out and foresee the dangers to us. And so I think trying to create artificial life or imitate nature or even improve on it or even surpass it, it contains some dangers.
Right. Actually, let's end on a happy note. I have a question about Wonder Woman. Thoughts about Wonder Woman. Is she a good Amazon? We talked about that Amazons aren't actually Greek, but aside from that, do you like Wonder Woman? Do you feel that she is a good representation of a strong warrior woman?
I like the fact that Wonder Woman is always fighting for truth and justice in the same way that Superman does. So I do like Wonder Woman, but I especially like in the first Wonder Woman movie, the first third of the movie, where it shows her training or watching the Amazons of Themyscira training, and the fact that the directors chose real athletes instead of just actors,
Right,
actors,
supermodels.
supermodels or extras. She chose people. She chose women who were skilled and strong, every color, every size, every age. That was really, I thought, really optimistic and heartening. And everyone I know said we want more of those Amazons. So uh, I hope there'll be some more movies that feature Wonder Woman with real Amazons.
I think it's awesome. And I think it's a great place to sort of end our interview. Thank you so much for coming
Thank
on and
you.
talking about robots and dinosaurs and Amazons and video games and pop culture. I mean, I think it's a fun subject, but it's educational as well. And that's
That's
exactly the
right.
goal of history and games, is to entertain as well as educate. So
Thank you.